Hello, everyone. I am Lars Howard, once again with On the Fringes of Sound, and today we are talking with Clayton, also known as Wiley Soule. How you doing today, Clayton?
Doing well. How about you, Lars?
I'm doing pretty good. Getting started, let's talk about your new album that's coming out, right? So this
Indeed.
one's coming out roughly a year after your previous one, and it sounds like it's a bit more on the ambient side than your previous release. So what exactly were you going for on this release, like Kaiju Vermin? And you feel like you hit it?
I mean, it's kind of reflected in the cover art of both of the EPs. Like, Ben Midnight was very, I feel like I was attacking an easel with a piece of charcoal. It's very much music that's made from what's left after, right? Like I've got this kind of big obsession with like, if we were all making music that sort of touches this idea of like tension around the apocalypse, the end times, right? So I've got this big obsession with trying to make music with what's left afterwards, right? Because I'm not content to just think of this idea of us ending. I'm always trying to reach through and go, okay, after the grief, like after the loss, what is that? And Ben Midnight was all about violence and extreme, like being chased and anxiety.
Right.
And this one, I was very much I wanted to hear color, right? Like I've got kind of incidental synesthesia, that arises a lot. Like I'll taste sounds or I'll feel them scraping at the back of my neck sometimes, or, and I'm always trying to respond in some way to that. And what I wanted to do with Kaiju Vermin was see if I could elicit more color. Like I want it to be vibrant, whereas, with Ben Midnight, I wanted it all to be sort of shrouded in shadow, very black and white, kind of sepia toned, sentient trash music.
Gotcha.
Like I wanted like Kaiju Vermin to be like something a bit more reflective of sweetness and, and fullness. Like I want to hear grapes, and I want to hear magenta. I want to hear all those things colliding. And I think I did. Like I at least hit it to my contentment this time.
So overall, you would say it's like you kind of make post-apocalyptic music.
Yeah, I think that we're all sort of toying around with that idea because it's so the idea of dissolution, societal dissolution and collapse is sort of on everybody's mind all the time, and we're all trying to figure out ways to cope with that.
Right.
And one of my, having gone through, I think, without going too deep into it, having suffered some pretty big losses early in life, that's always been something that now that I've done a lot of my internal work, it's very close to me. The idea of like, yeah, everything can fall apart, but it's not dead. Everything's just temporal. Like it's only here for a while.
Okay.
And so that's kind of where my orientation is with any of the music that I make. After things fall apart, they decay. And after decay, things spring back to life. So I'm always trying to, I've got some very, workable examples in my own life that, I draw from, and that's something that I keep trying to conjure, like with the first track, Not Even Your Moon.
Right.
It's dedicated to a very close friend of mine. At one point in our lives, we had an irreconcilable difference. I made a decision to cut the friendship off entirely. We just stopped. One day we just entirely stopped, and then 15 years later we bounced into each other and went, what was that? Let's give this another try.
Right.
And that friendship sprang to life in a really healthy, really rich way that if we had not suffered that loss, would not have been available to us. Because we know we've got this wound, like we also have this kind of planter box, right? Like there's seeds in the wound. And so something can grow out of that. And so that's, I don't know, it's just something that I'm always trying to reach for with at least this phase of my music composition.
So with this album, though, like I noticed your first album, it did come out through a label. Is this one coming out through a label as well, or are you going like completely independent with this one?
Yeah. So the first album was it came out through Real More Real.
Yeah.
So they were kind of the ones that helped me kind of work up the courage to be able to publish something concrete and know that it could be put in front of an audience and listened to. Although they helped me from start to finish with Ben Midnight. Mm-hmm. Like we did the mixing and mastering, mixing ourselves here, like I and a friend of mine.
Right.
But they helped with every other aspect. And then because they have their label isn't just a label, it's kind of tough to explain. One of the things that they do, they've got a music residency that they do every year called Campient. And that's how I met them. I was part of the music residency. So you go out with 22 other artists for 44 hours and you make an album from sounds that you collect in the woods. There's 2 of these albums in existence now. One's about to be released and one was released that I was on before. So this year, flash forward, I said, hey guys, I know you're going to do this again. I'd like to offer you my cooking skills. I'll cater for the music residency this year that I went to as an attendee last year. And in trade, they've been really nurturing and helpful and like, okay, we know that you want to do this release on your own. Wherever we can, we'll help by giving you advice or like a little bump here and there. And so, yeah, I wanted the exercise of doing it from start to finish, all on my own. Promotion, the whole thing, like seeking out interviews, seeking out radio play. Did most of the art myself, with the exception of the immediate cover art for the entire EP. Like that central images is somebody else, Zas Abra on Twitter, who's a fantastic artist. I composed part of the music with that image sitting right here, perched over my laptop all the time, which is something I try to do. So I was just trying to, I wanted to have these exercises of relationship building, and then use the more real relationship that we already had to give everybody a chance to grow a little bit more. Like they didn't have to worry about the food. I don't have to worry about trying to figure out everything from scratch. And that's something I really want to knit into every part of my music as I'm building it.
Promotion is like the last step in releasing something. And to me, it's like, it's the least fun part of the entire process. I absolutely hate trying to promote.
I don't think that our approaches are too entirely different. I think that there's a huge amount to be said for, well, wait a second, it's not me just trying to grab food off the table for myself. Like I want to be able to place something on the table so that other people can also, so that all of our exploration is sort of lifted up together.
Right.
I'm just a little guy, but I can do that. I can do that easily. You can retweet somebody's music. You can get feedback. You can encourage somebody when you hear them sounding low or lost or, feeling like it's pointless. And I think that sort of sits at the center of how I want to self-promote. I think that we're all a little bit low-key vulnerable all the time because we're really trying to reach something that is personal.
Right.
And that's the easiest place to be wounded.
So, I always ask everybody who's married and a musician, right? It's like, does your wife listen to your music?
She hates it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. She has this thing where she'll go, why does everything you make always feel like aliens touching my face? She's got very, very strong pop sensibilities for things that she likes. She asked me to work on a piece with her this summer. We're going to take an old piece of music and we're going to make something together that we both agree on for fun. And so it's probably going to sit way outside of my style because it's just not hers. Right. And I can't wait to have that challenge of relinquishing control. Not to mention my wife is she's fantastically supportive.
Right.
She might not like my music, but I get supported every way that counts. Right. I get to have my little goofy room where I've got all my equipment. Mm-hmm. I get to fiddle around with it. I get to be an emotional wreck when I'm nervous about, release day.
You have your own room and you're sitting there working on stuff. And it's like, my wife will sometimes she'll just hang out in the room. Cause it's I also have usually I have my PlayStation or whatever in there and there's a TV and, I'll be sitting there working and she'll be working on homework or whatever. And she'll kind of peep her head up and just is this supposed to sound like that? Yes. Oh
yeah. right when you think you're onto something hot. Yeah. And I think that's really, I don't know about you, but I really find that to be helpful because it's really easy for me to get, caught in my imagination, right?
Right.
To the exclusion of all else. It's really healthy in a lot of ways to be working with my DAW or my semi-modular synthesizers or writing code for music, or doing some aspect where I'm micromanaging stuff here. And other people in the world don't have to suffer that same busybody bullshit, right? That I sort of low-key carry with me through my life. One of the hazards is I'm off in the woods by myself long enough where I start getting weird. And so it's nice to have somebody kind of walk up and go, pop.
Yeah.
Everything else exists. Guess what?
When did you actually begin making music? Is this a lifelong kind of thing for you, or is it just a more recent development?
About 14 years ago. 13 years ago is when I started doing it. It was like a year after I got clean.
Right.
And I was starting to extricate myself from being a chef. And so I really, and I was like, okay, I got to have some art of some kind in my life. And it just so happened that I was teaching at a cooking school. And one of my fellow teachers was like, hey, I hear you singing in the kitchen all the time. Do you want to make some music together? And so we, within a weekend, wrote 12 songs that I still think are pretty goddamn good. But we didn't end up developing on that. But while we were working together, I was like, I kind of feel guilty because all I'm doing is singing and going, hey, Danny, could you go dung dung dung? And then he would try and reproduce what I'm vocally giving him. And so he's like, tell you what, go get a drum machine. Go get a K-pad, which is not what that is. And so I went out and bought a Chaos pad.
Oh, okay.
Thinking a Korg KP3, thinking that I was getting a drum machine. Not knowing how anything works at all in this life, right?
Right.
Got it home, and my roommate, who was just this sour IT guy, is watching me sitting in front of this thing going, now what do I do? Storms into his room, gets me a cracked copy of Cubase, brings it out on his little flash drive and says, put this on your computer. You have to put the sound into it. You are a moron. Goodbye. I'm going in my room. Don't ask for help. And that's where I started.
Hey, here's this USB drive. You just don't ask me for help or anything, but put this on your computer.
Yep. It's a cracked version. Learn how to do it, and then go buy it if you have any decency. Goodbye. And he went in his room and he never came out again. And I just stayed in front of my laptop with my little K-pad, started building things. In fact, I still got the little guy right here.
Oh, wow.
Kind of sits right next to me. So I've been doing this for about 13 years, and I went to UW's DX Arts program, and got very into how do we design sound sort of from the ground up and doing digital signal processing. And, now I'm sort of emerging in the past 4 years into finished pieces and, and things that I want to present to the world. I'm like, okay, now let's take some of these different etudes and things that, my different little studies and exercises and turn them into things that are storytelling. One of the ways I think about making music right now is I'll make things, either with semi-modularity or writing some, signal processing code in Super Collider. And then I'll pass those things back and forth between the elements. And then from that material that I've kind of tweaked and fiddled with, because I'll dump it in there and then go, okay, I'm hearing something, but let's develop on that. And I'll change the code so that I've got a catalog of vocabulary that I can work with. And then I'll start making things from that.
You've kind of explained a little bit of it so far,
Sure.
But on the subject of your songwriting, your production, what kind of setup do you have for your work? Is it primarily a software kind of setup, or is there hardware linked into that? You mentioned you have a semi-modular setup as well.
Most of the sounds that have come, the bass sounds for this EP, mm-hmm. The Moog components, that's going to show up a little bit more later. I've been working with it, but it didn't show up as much on Kaiju Vermin. Most of that's actually a Behringer Neutron bunch of samples that I just built, and then the ID 700 emulator, and then a whole bunch of field recordings that I've just done a ton of signal processing to, but I'm always entering at a different spot, whether it's in my DAW using Serum and a wavetable that ends up sounding unrelated to its source material. It's, sometimes that's what, this is it. So I'm just always picking things up and putting them down, polishing them, putting them back down. Sometimes it's modular. Sometimes I really, really want in my next phases to build things that I'm playing more immediately. Right now, that's been my way of operating, is hold a story, want to tell a story, also letting the sounds erode that story and change it, but wherever I enter, whether it's semi-modular or writing code in Super Collider, and I try to think of it as I'm dropping down on a planet, I'm stumbling on an object. Wait a second, I think this is a musical instrument. And then that's my starting point. So
it sounds like it's a very hybridized setup. You just kind of
hybridized.
Yeah, you just kind of pick things from all over the place. It could start with a field recording. It could start with mm-hmm. a little melody that you've got going on your semi-modular setup, or You could just be starting. Do you ever start with samples as well? Like,
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I spend an inordinate amount of time listening to the samples I've either created or recorded or collected. And I do it all the time. Like I work at a hospital where I'm writing notes, you know, a lot. And while I'm writing notes, I've got, you know, the same little farty noise in 30 different iterations. And I'll just listen to those over and over and over until they start telling me a rhythm or giving me a notion about, hey, if I stretch that, it'll sound like it's breathing a little bit, you know, or this chime is like, you know, has a throb and a pulse to it, you know, after not just the beating that you get, but like the silence that it leaves behind has this sort of implication. I try and think of my setup where it's like, you know, I can make all these incidental sounds and just be a madman and push things in all directions until something kind of keep hitting the rock until a statue emerges. But I think where the real important work is just being able to bear repetition. I think just not sort of having an expectation when I sit down. Like I'm really, really good at just kind of heaving over the side any idea that I'm going to come up with anything significant.
Yeah.
Because I just have had so many teachers that have encouraged me to sit down, take your samples, and just do what I call flicking them up on your DAW. You know, like that's one of the things that Reaper's so useful for is you can trim and throw things so quickly. You know, you can have like several different tracks and cut and like just paste things all over the place. You know, if I'm stuck creatively and I don't have like a thing that I don't have a starting point already, inevitably some of those intersections will sort of imply whatever's next. And then I just follow it.
With your big hybridized setup here, is there like any one piece that you really like to use a lot? Do you find yourself using like one particular tool for a lot of your work, or do you just kind of keep it all over the place as far as like which VSTs or pieces of hardware you're using?
I gotta say that for a little while, because it was sort of my first really semi-modular physical experience, this Behringer Neutron was a really, really useful tool. But I have to say that I think that that's a great evening alone, just making sounds and seeing what the implications and potentials of things are. I think where I get a lot of gratification is where I take that and start cutting it apart and feeding it to Super Collider. I think that's probably for me one of the more satisfying, you know, but I'm like feeding the sample to itself. You know, like I'm changing the rate in one buffer at a different time than I'm changing the rate in the other buffer. It's still the same sample, but it's different things are being done with that. And then I'm morphing between the two. And so you get these like kind of smeared experiences of the same familiar melody line. I don't know. I like doing things like that because it gets me out of the intellect part of it. Right. And back into now I may have created that, but now it's something that I have to respond to emotionally. I always kind of come back to thinking about Basquiat and like how if he didn't want you to notice something, he would, or if he wanted you to note something in one of his paintings, one of his techniques would be to write or, you know, paint a word and then X it out, you know, as if he's striking it out, but he's drawing your attention specifically to it. The whole idea of like completely doing things aleatorically, you know, like where we just randomly throw everything. Right. Like I use that as a mode to disrupt myself, but I don't like to stay there. After that point, I like building on top of it.
So that's like the brainstorming, and then it's like you take the pieces that work and put those together into something a bit more cohesive.
Yeah, and then in the case of this last EP, you know, like what I've done then is then take those chunks, pull them back out, and place them someplace else. Like break it apart into little pieces and rearrange them. Now I've started out with these first two EPs very much like, you know what, I want all the room in the world to do whatever I want. And so I'm just going to see if I can break a whole bunch of expectations just from the get. That's not where I'm going to stay for the next phase of things. You know, but I like that tension of with experimental or ambient music or, you know, noise. It's sort of this tug of war between what is, I think, you know, it's like going to Carl's Jr. in Hawaii. You could be having sushi, you could be having manapua. Yeah, and yet you're lined up for Carl's Jr. You know, and I like that war between like kind of the thing that's familiar and the thing that makes you risk grief.
So you're talking about like you know, right now you're kind of you're in this phase where you're trying to, have that tension between what's expected and then like what actually happens. And then talking about like where you're moving for the next phase. So, this album's coming out on May the 1st. And, I really like the way it sounds. It sounds amazing. So what's next after this? What's like the next phase? Are you already kind of planning what you're going to follow this up with?
It's nice to have this releasing because now I'm free to focus on sort of a generative patch. Like following like Kaiju Vermin, there's going to be an EP this summer of remixes that some acquaintances that I have worked with before, either, in code writing with Super Collider. I've got a friend who I trade cooking lessons. I was a chef for 25 years, so I trade cooking lessons for coding lessons. And so he's doing a remix for me and trade for some other things. And then I've done some remixes for some other people that are going to be doing likewise for a release coming up. Probably, I think maybe June is what we're going to shoot for. I've already got final versions of 2 of them. And I really like them. I mean, the whole idea of handing your music over to somebody, I like that idea of relinquishing control. And so it's really interesting seeing those reinterpretations. And then my own exercises, I've got a couple of collaborations. Hopefully those will percolate along slowly, but a large part of my next phase of work is going to be beat oriented. I mean, if you listen to what I've made so far, a lot of it is suggestions of beats that are pulled back. The first EP had some beats that would like kind of begin and then dissolve. I want to do some studies of some like pretty traditional sorts of beat, electronic beat, techno beat, those kinds of things, like those larger ideas without staying in them so long that I'm like kind of clinging to them for safety. I want to do the same thing that I do with sound, which is tear it apart.
So on the you're saying like the collaborations and the remixes that people are doing of your songs and the ones you're doing of their songs, is that all going to come out like through your Bandcamp, or you guys have like a label or a collaborative kind of effort? Or
that's a good question. I think, as we all know, Bandcamp's kind of limited in its ability to. You're not able to divide profits. That's one of the functions that it lacks right now.
That would be really nice. I mean, maybe they can use some of that Epic Games money to give us that. Just saying.
Maybe so. Just maybe so. So far, my working idea has been to just straight trade. With it, kind of the idea of, I'm working on this remix for you. You sell it. Do whatever you want. If you end up making some money, great. If you get famous, please fold me in by mentioning who did it.
Right.
If you want to talk about sharing the big pile of gold coin, great. So far, there's been no big pile of gold coin, which is really useful.
Unfortunately, that big pile is all Dogecoin. So, oops.
Yeah. At this level of relationship building, I think it's really I think it's a hobbling that's really useful.
Right.
It's really helpful to me to look at a fellow artist that that we're trying to help each other do something or disrupt each other's process and help each other in that way. It's really helpful to not be like, I'm doing this for you and you're going to make an absolute shitload of money. Like no one I'm working with right now is making an absolute shitload of money. They may be prospering a little more, a little bit less.
Right.
Not enough where we're resenting each other's pile of gold coin. I think there's a lot to be had with non-exponential growth at least not in the beginning. Like when it happens, right?
That's what I like about our little kind of community of like electronic musicians is like kind of insulated from like people who are just trying to come and get in and run scams and run out.
Yeah, usually don't see folks like that get a lot of traction. I don't know. There's so many inroads to becoming a resource hoarder. Attention is so intoxicating. You want it to stay once it's there.
Very true.
That whole question of staying relevant, I think, is entirely about grief avoidance. Like you don't want to face the fact that maybe you're just not as cool as you were yesterday, and you don't know how to inhabit that anymore. Instead of allowing yourself to just be, you know what? Now I have all this space to do whatever I want.
So we're looking at lots of collaborations and some remixes coming from you. Not 100% sure on where it's going to be released through yet, correct?
No, right now we're just doing the Not Even Your Moon remixes. When I do release that, I'm going to be releasing that myself. It's just going to be a modest Bandcamp release.
Okay.
If it seems to do well enough, I may, talk to everybody involved and see if we can, release it to other outlets as well, minus Spotify, because they're bastards. I want to make a few singles. I want to expose those and just let those release and gain some momentum. And my hope is that, over time, just kind of being sort of in the swim with a lot of different artists and different labels that I'm acquainted with now, whatever makes sense as a match. Like I want to make another, I think next year, either an album or an EP, because there's enough material to support that exploration. Mm-hmm. In the in-between time, I want to do some exercises and just say, here's what I do. Real More Real has kind of got we have a relationship that's, I would say, mutually supportive enough for me to possibly go back to that well, and release something through them. I'm also want to see what another label might do in terms of pushing me in a direction.
Everybody needs to make sure you're following. What was your screen? What was your tag?
It's @Soule_Wiley. Clayton is Wiley Soule on Twitter.
Clayton, thanks for joining us. It was great talking to you. Great hearing about like all your methods and stuff and what you got coming up next. And we're looking forward to hearing it.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to putting it out. And I appreciate you having me.
Oh, not a problem. We'll talk to you again later.
Indeed.
All right. Bye-bye.